On the outskirts of a quiet desert town, Mark Harlow, a skilled but unassuming car mechanic, was wrapping up another long day of work. His garage was nothing special, just a small workshop nestled between towering sand dunes, where he repaired old trucks and worn-out vehicles from passing travelers. Tonight, though, something felt different. As Mark wiped the oil from his hands and locked up, a strange light caught his eye in the distance. It wasn't the usual flicker of headlights or the reflection of the stars on the desert sands. This light shimmered, glowing faintly like something from out of this world. Curiosity tugged at him, and before he knew it, he was climbing into his beat-up truck, driving toward the source of the glow. The desert winds howled softly, filling the silence as he approached what seemed to be a crash site. His heart pounded when he saw it, a sleek, metallic craft partially buried in the sand. Unlike any vehicle Mark had ever seen, it glistened under the moonlight, with intricate patterns glowing on its surface. He parked the truck, stepping out cautiously, his boots crunching softly in the cool desert night. The craft was damaged, clearly having crash-landed, with smoke hissing from several vents and deep scratches marring its otherwise flawless surface. Mark circled the ship, trying to make sense of it. It didn't belong here. The desert was quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath for what was to come. He couldn't leave it alone, not when his curiosity and instinct as a mechanic pulled him closer. Peering into the tinted glass of the cockpit, Mark's breath caught in his throat. Inside, two figures lay unconscious, alien girls, pale as the moonlight that bathed the desert. Their features were delicate, almost ethereal, with markings that glowed faintly, tracing patterns along their skin. He knew immediately these weren't humans. Mark hesitated only for a moment before his instinct to help took over. He grabbed his tools from the truck, hurried to the cockpit, and carefully pried open the hatch. As it opened, a soft, unfamiliar fragrance filled the air. It was sweet, almost floral, unlike anything he had smelled before. "Hey, are you okay?" Mark's voice was soft, filled with concern, as he leaned into the cockpit. One of the girls stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were unlike any eyes he had ever seen, large and glowing with a soft, iridescent light. For a moment, their gazes met, and Mark felt something stir deep within him. These girls needed help, and somehow he knew he was the only one who could give it. With a mix of urgency and care, Mark checked their pulses, thankfully steady. The damage to the craft didn't seem to have injured them critically, but they were in no shape to move. He began inspecting the ship, looking for a way to stabilize it. The technology was far beyond anything he had ever worked on, but the fundamentals were the same: power, wiring, structure. As Mark worked, the night seemed to grow quieter, as if the desert itself was watching. Occasionally, the alien girls would stir, their soft voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Their words were like music, strange, melodic, and otherworldly. But it wasn't their language that drew him in. It was the sense that they trusted him, even if they didn't understand him. One of the girls, her voice weak but clear, whispered something to her companion. Mark couldn't understand the words, but the tone was enough to tell him they were afraid. He glanced back at them, giving them a reassuring smile. "It's okay. I'll fix this. I can help you." The older of the two, who seemed to be in charge, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. She didn't speak, but her eyes told him enough. She wasn't sure why this human was helping them, but she was willing to trust him. For now, Mark worked late into the night, his hands moving with a precision born from years of experience. The alien ship, though advanced, had the same underlying principles as any machine. Slowly but surely, he began to piece it back together, patching up the damaged components and rerouting power where he could. The girls watched him closely, their fear slowly ebbing as they realized he was doing everything he could to help them. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the ship hummed to life. A soft, blue glow pulsed from its engines, and the tension in the air seemed to lift. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow. stepping back to admire his work. He wasn't sure what would happen next. These girls weren't from this world, and he had no idea what kind of trouble they were in. But for now, they were safe, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Mark knew he had made the right choice. "Let's get you out of here," he said quietly, more to himself than to the girls. Whatever adventure lay ahead, he was ready to face it. Mark turned toward the cockpit, glancing at the alien girls who were now more alert, though still weak. The older one, who seemed to have taken charge earlier, sat up slightly, wincing as she moved. Her eyes fixed on Mark with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. The younger one, still dazed, but clearly regaining her strength, reached out to her companion as if seeking reassurance. Mark wasn't sure what to do next. The ship was partially functional, but it was far from ready for flight, especially after the crash. He considered his options, weighing the risks of staying in the open desert versus bringing them back to his garage. The ship was too conspicuous here, and if anyone else came across it, there could be complications, authorities, the government, or worse. "You need to move this ship," Mark said, more to himself than the girls, knowing they probably didn't understand his words. He gestured to the open desert, hoping they'd get the message. "It's not safe out here." The older girl tilted her head slightly, trying to make sense of his words. Her fingers brushed across a panel near the cockpit, and the ship's engines hummed softly, their blue glow dimming. The craft began to shift, lifting slightly off the ground. Mark's eyes widened in surprise. It wasn't flight ready, but it could hover. He climbed into the truck, signaling them to follow him. The older girl seemed to understand, guiding the hovering craft behind his vehicle. As they moved toward town, the early morning light spread across the desert, casting long shadows. Mark kept checking his rearview mirror, still unable to believe what was happening. Aliens in his desert town. It felt surreal. The garage came into view, and Mark quickly parked inside. The girls managed to maneuver the ship into a nearby shed, the craft barely fitting inside. With the ship concealed, Mark breathed a sigh of relief. For now, they were safe, hidden from prying eyes. Once inside, Mark turned to face the girls. They had exited the ship, standing awkwardly in the dim light of the garage. Despite their alien features, there was something undeniably human about their nervousness, the way they stood close to each other, watching Mark closely. "Okay, let's figure out how to help you too," Mark muttered, more to himself. He pulled out a few blankets from a storage cabinet, offering them to the girls. They looked puzzled at first, but accepted them, draping them over their thin frames. The older girl stepped forward, her expression softening. She pointed at herself, then spoke in that melodic, unfamiliar language. "Lyra," she said, her voice clear. Then she gestured to the younger girl. "Talia." Mark nodded slowly, pointing to himself in return. "Mark." Lyra repeated his name softly, a faint smile crossing her lips. Talia, still shy, mimicked her sister and said his name as well, her voice barely above a whisper. The ice was breaking, slowly but surely. Even if they couldn't fully communicate, they were starting to understand each other. Mark motioned for them to sit at the small table he kept in the corner of the garage, offering them water and some food. It wasn't much, just some sandwiches and bottled water from his lunchbox, but they accepted it gratefully. He watched as they examined the food, clearly unfamiliar with it, but eventually took small bites, cautious but hungry. As they ate in silence, Mark's mind raced with questions. Where had they come from? Why were they here? And what kind of danger were they in? He had no answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just leave them to fend for themselves. They were in trouble, and somehow they had landed in his life. Now it was his responsibility to help them. After they finished eating, Lyra stood up, walking toward the ship. She gestured for Mark to follow her inside. Hesitant but curious, he stepped into the ship's cockpit, where Lyra began tapping on a small glowing screen. Strange symbols and images flickered to life, and Mark's eyes widened as he saw what appeared to be a map of the stars. Lyra pointed to a cluster of stars far from Earth, then to their current location, indicating the vast distance they had traveled. Mark's breath caught. "You're stranded, aren't you?" he asked, though he knew they couldn't understand. Lyra's expression was enough of an answer. Her eyes were filled with worry, and she nodded slightly. The ship was badly damaged, and they had no way to return home. They were alone, far from everything they knew. For a long moment, Mark stood there, absorbing the weight of the situation. These girls were far from home, lost in a strange world, and their only hope was the help of the mechanic who had stumbled upon them by chance. It was overwhelming, but Mark had never been one to back down from a challenge. He had spent his life fixing things, solving problems that seemed impossible. This wasn't any different, right? "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure out how to fix your ship, but we need to keep a low profile. No one can know you're here, understand?" Lyra nodded slowly, her expression serious. She understood enough to know they needed to stay hidden. As Mark stepped out of the ship, he glanced at the horizon, where the sun was now fully up. His quiet life as a small-town mechanic had just taken a wild turn, but strangely, he didn't feel overwhelmed. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose. These girls needed him, and in a way, he needed them too. The day ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and unknown dangers, but Mark was ready. Whatever came next, he was determined to protect these girls and help them find their way home. Mark woke up the next morning, his body sore from the previous day's frantic repairs. The sun was already blazing high over the desert, casting sharp beams through the small windows of his garage. For a moment, he wondered if the events of last night had been nothing more than a strange dream. But when he saw the sleek alien ship tucked away in his shed, and the two girls, Lyra and Talia, still resting on the makeshift beds he had set up, he knew it was real. He brewed himself a quick cup of coffee, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. As he sipped, he glanced at the two alien girls. They looked peaceful now, but he knew they must be terrified deep down, stranded on a foreign planet, surrounded by strangers, and unsure if they'd ever return home. It was hard to imagine what that felt like. The quiet of the morning was soon interrupted by a distant rumble. Mark tensed. It wasn't the usual sound of passing trucks on the highway. It was deeper, heavier. He put down his mug and rushed outside, his heart pounding. A dark, military-grade vehicle was kicking up dust as it approached from the direction of town. Mark cursed under his breath. He knew that nothing good ever came from vehicles like that in a place like this. If the authorities were already sniffing around, it wouldn't be long before they found out about Lyra and Talia. He quickly moved back into the garage, signaling for the girls to stay out of sight. The vehicle came to a halt outside the garage, and two men in dark suits stepped out. They were tall and stern-faced, their sunglasses hiding any hint of emotion. Mark wiped his hands on his jeans, walking out to meet them, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Mark asked, his voice steady, though inside he was on edge. One of the men stepped forward, flashing a badge. "We're with a government investigation unit," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "There have been reports of strange activity in this area, specifically an unidentified object falling from the sky last night. We're conducting a sweep of the region and would like to ask a few questions." Mark's heart raced. "Unidentified object," he echoed, trying to sound clueless. "I didn't see anything unusual, just another quiet night." The agent's gaze hardened, as if he could sense Mark was holding something back. "Mind if we take a look around your property? Just routine." Mark hesitated for a split second, which didn't go unnoticed by the agents. He forced a casual shrug. "Sure, be my guest. But like I said, it's just me and a bunch of old car parts out here." The two agents didn't waste time. They split up, one heading toward the garage while the other wandered toward the shed where the alien ship was hidden. Mark's pulse quickened, and he scrambled for a way to distract them. "Hey, I got a few old engines in the back if you're interested," Mark called out to the agent near the shed, hoping to divert his attention. "Stuff people left behind years ago. Might be more exciting than whatever you're looking for." The agent gave him a long, suspicious look, but after a moment, he turned away from the shed and followed Mark to the garage. Mark could feel sweat trickling down the back of his neck as the other agent wandered through the cluttered workshop, poking at toolboxes and piles of scrap metal. Minutes passed in tense silence. The agents asked a few more questions, but Mark stuck to his story, playing the role of the oblivious mechanic. When the agent near the shed looked like he might circle back toward the hidden ship, Mark quickly threw another distraction his way, offering to show them a rare car part he had lying around. Eventually, the two agents finished their sweep. They didn't seem fully convinced, but without solid evidence, they couldn't push further. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Harlow," the lead agent said, his voice cool and impassive. "If you notice anything unusual, you'll contact us, won't you?" "Of course," Mark replied with a tight smile. "You guys take care." The agents exchanged a glance, then returned to their vehicle. The dark car rumbled to life and sped away, kicking up another cloud of dust as it disappeared down the road. Mark watched until they were out of sight before letting out the breath he had been holding. He turned and hurried back into the garage, finding Lyra and Talia peeking out from behind a stack of tires. Lyra's glowing eyes were wide with fear, while Talia clutched her sister's arm, her face pale. "It's okay," Mark said quickly, crouching down to their level. "They're gone for now, but we have to be careful. They'll be back, and next time, they might not take no for an answer." Lyra nodded slowly, her expression serious. She didn't need to speak to convey her understanding. They were in more danger than ever, and Mark realized that keeping them hidden wasn't going to be easy. That night, Mark worked late again, this time on a different plan. Hiding them here in the garage was a temporary solution, but it wouldn't last. He had to find a way to get the ship operational and move them somewhere safer, somewhere beyond the reach of the government's watchful eyes. As he tinkered with the alien technology, Lyra sat beside him, watching his every move. At times, she'd point out symbols or offer quiet, unintelligible advice, trying to help him make sense of the complex systems. Together, they worked in quiet harmony, two beings from different worlds, united by a common goal. But the looming threat of discovery weighed heavily on them. Time was running out, and Mark knew that if they didn't leave soon, everything, his life, their lives, could be torn apart by forces far beyond their control. The days following the visit from the agents were tense. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were constantly watching him, waiting for him to slip up. Every car that passed by, every unexpected sound in the night, felt like a warning that they were getting closer. He knew they would return, more prepared and more determined. The clock was ticking, and he had to figure out how to fix the alien ship fast. Lyra and Talia had stayed hidden most of the time, cautious but slowly growing accustomed to Mark's garage. Their initial wariness toward him had softened, and even though they couldn't speak the same language, they found ways to communicate. Lyra, the older sister, seemed to have a keen understanding of the ship's technology, and often sat with Mark as he worked, pointing at parts and giving him instructions through gestures. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the dunes, Mark sat on the floor of the garage, staring at the ship's engine. It was like nothing he had ever seen, intricate, almost organic in its design. Wires and tubes seemed to pulse with energy, but every time he thought he had made progress, something new would malfunction. The complexity of the technology was overwhelming, and Mark could feel his frustration growing. "I don't know how much more of this I can do," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't sure if Lyra could understand him, but the stress in his voice was clear. Lyra, who had been quietly observing him from the corner, stepped forward. She crouched beside him and gently touched his arm, her iridescent eyes glowing softly in the dim light. Mark looked at her, feeling a strange comfort in her presence. She pointed to the engine, then to her chest, indicating she knew how to help. Mark handed her the tools, watching as she expertly began manipulating parts of the engine. Despite the language barrier, it was clear Lyra had a deep understanding of the ship's technology, far beyond anything Mark had seen in his life. Her hands moved quickly, fluidly, with a confidence that reassured him they were getting closer to fixing it. As they worked, the soft hum of the alien technology filled the air. Hours passed, and for the first time in days, Mark felt a flicker of hope. They were making progress. Talia, who had been resting, stirred and walked over to join them. She sat cross-legged nearby, watching her sister and Mark work, her glowing eyes curious and wide. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, the moment felt oddly peaceful. The three of them, so different, had somehow formed a bond of trust and understanding. Just when they thought they were getting close to repairing the ship, a distant sound shattered the calm. A low rumble, the unmistakable growl of approaching vehicles. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He rushed to the window, peering out into the desert. Dust was rising in the distance. Not just one vehicle this time, but several. "They're back," Mark whispered, his stomach twisting into knots. He turned to the alien girls, his mind racing. "We need to hide you. Now." Lyra's eyes widened with fear, and Talia instinctively moved closer to her sister. Mark gestured for them to follow him. He led them to a hidden trapdoor in the floor of the garage, an old storage space he rarely used but had cleaned out in case of an emergency. "You'll be safe down here," he said, helping them into the cramped space. "Just stay quiet." Once they were inside, Mark hurriedly closed the trapdoor, covering it with a few heavy crates. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood, just in time to hear the vehicles pull up outside. The rumble of engines died down, replaced by the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. Mark wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped outside to greet the uninvited guests. This time, it wasn't just two agents. A small team had arrived, armed soldiers, their expressions cold and unreadable. Behind them, two black SUVs sat parked, their engines still warm. The lead agent from the last visit stepped forward, his dark sunglasses reflecting the fading sunlight. "Mr. Harlow," the agent said, his voice laced with suspicion. "We received some new information. There's been more unusual activity in this area. We're going to need to take a closer look." Mark's mind raced. "I already told you, I haven't seen anything strange. Just fixing cars and trying to mind my own business." The agent's eyes narrowed, clearly not buying it. "We're not asking this time," he said, motioning for the soldiers to fan out and search the property. Mark felt a surge of panic. He had to keep them from finding the trapdoor. "You're wasting your time," he said, stepping in front of one of the soldiers. "It's just me here. No one's been out here except for some old customers." The soldier shoved past him without a word, and Mark clenched his fists. He couldn't stop them from searching, but he needed to buy time. He glanced toward the shed where the alien ship was hidden, hoping they wouldn't think to look too closely. Minutes felt like hours as the soldiers combed through the garage, pulling open drawers, shifting boxes, and checking every corner. Mark's palms were slick with sweat as one of the soldiers moved dangerously close to the hidden trapdoor. Mark quickly stepped forward, trying to seem casual but blocking the way. "Hey, mind being careful," he said, forcing a grin. "Some of this stuff's been around for years. Could collapse if you're not careful." The soldier glanced at him, unimpressed, but stepped back slightly, apparently losing interest. Mark let out a small breath of relief. After what felt like an eternity, the agent finally called off the search. "We'll be back," he warned, his tone cold. "And next time, we'll have more than just a team." Mark's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "Sure thing. You know where to find me." The agent gave him one last, piercing look before signaling his team to leave. The soldiers piled back into their vehicles, and within minutes, the roar of engines faded into the distance. Mark waited until the dust settled before rushing back inside. He moved the crates, yanked open the trapdoor, and helped Lyra and Talia out. They looked shaken but unharmed. "We need to move fast," Mark said, his voice urgent. "They'll be back, and next time, they won't give up so easily. We have to get your ship running, or we won't make it out of here." Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with determination. She knew the stakes were high, and so did Mark. The clock was ticking, and their window of escape was closing fast. The quiet that followed the soldiers' departure felt heavy, as if the desert was holding its breath once again. Mark glanced at the setting sun, casting long shadows across the sand dunes. They didn't have much time. The agents would return, and next time, they wouldn't leave without answers. "Let's get to work," Mark said, his voice filled with urgency. He led Lyra and Talia back to the shed where the alien ship was hidden. The sleek, damaged craft gleamed faintly in the fading light, its technology still alien, still beyond anything he had ever known. But somehow, thanks to Lyra's guidance, he was beginning to understand it. Mark felt the pressure mounting. He didn't know how much longer they could keep up this charade. If the agents found the ship, or worse, discovered the alien girls, they'd be taken, interrogated, and possibly never seen again. The thought made his gut churn. He had to get them out of here. Inside the garage, the ship's engine still sat open, wires and circuits exposed, humming faintly with energy. Lyra immediately went to work, her hands moving swiftly over the controls. Mark followed her lead, using the tools he had and improvising where needed. Despite the advanced technology, the core principles of mechanics were the same. Repair, reroute, power up. As they worked, Talia stood watch, her wide eyes darting nervously between the door and the horizon. Mark could see the fear in her face. She was younger, less confident than her sister, and the constant threat of being discovered weighed heavily on her. "Don't worry," Mark said gently as he worked, glancing at her. "We'll get you out of here." Talia didn't respond with words, but her eyes softened, showing a glimmer of trust. It was clear that despite their different worlds and languages, they were starting to believe in him, and he was determined not to let them down. Hours passed, and the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert bathed in the cool blue of twilight. Mark and Lyra continued to work tirelessly, the ship slowly coming back to life piece by piece. The hum of the engine grew stronger, and Mark could feel the energy pulsing through the craft. But just as hope began to swell in Mark's chest, the sound of approaching engines broke the silence again. This time, they were louder, closer, more vehicles than before. The agents were back, and it didn't sound like they were coming alone. "They're here," Talia whispered, her voice trembling. Mark cursed under his breath, wiping sweat from his brow. They weren't ready. The ship was still damaged, still too fragile to fly. They needed more time they didn't have. Lyra turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with desperation. She gestured at the ship, shaking her head slightly. Mark understood. They couldn't launch yet. The systems weren't stable. If they tried to take off now, the ship might not hold together. His mind raced. He needed a plan. They couldn't hide forever, and the soldiers would tear the place apart. Mark stood up, his jaw set with determination. He couldn't let them take the girls, but they couldn't flee either, not yet. "We'll stall them," Mark said, grabbing his jacket. "You two stay here, keep working. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Lyra's eyes widened with concern, but she didn't try to stop him. She knew it was their only chance. Talia reached out, her hand brushing his arm, her expression filled with worry. Mark gave her a reassuring nod before heading toward the door. As he stepped outside, the roar of engines became deafening. The SUVs from before had returned, but this time they were accompanied by several military trucks. Soldiers in full tactical gear dismounted, their faces obscured by helmets, and their guns gleamed in the moonlight. The lead agent, the same man from before, approached Mark with a cold, unflinching gaze. "We're not here for games this time, Harlow," the agent said, his voice laced with threat. "We know something's going on here, and we're going to find out what." Mark squared his shoulders, keeping his expression calm. "I already told you. It's just me here, fixing up old cars. You're wasting your time." The agent smirked, clearly unconvinced. "We'll see about that." He signaled to his men, and they began spreading out, searching the property. Mark's heart raced, but he kept his cool. He had to give Lyra and Talia as much time as possible. Every second counted. As the soldiers moved closer to the garage, Mark stepped in their path, blocking the door. "You can search the rest of the place, but this is private property. You don't have a warrant." The agent's smirk faded, replaced by a steely glare. "You think that matters now. Move aside." Mark didn't budge. He had to stall them. Somehow, he raised his hands, trying to look cooperative but firm. "I've got nothing to hide. Just give me a chance to show you there's nothing here." The agent's patience snapped. He motioned to one of the soldiers. "Search the garage." Now, Mark's heart sank. He had done everything he could, but it wasn't enough. As the soldier approached the garage, Mark braced himself for the worst. But just as the soldier reached for the door, a sudden, blinding light erupted from behind the building. The ground trembled, and the sound of the ship's engines roared to life. Mark's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't expected this, but somehow, Lyra and Talia had managed to power up the ship just in time. The soldiers froze, turning toward the source of the light, their weapons raised. "What the hell is that?" one of them shouted. Mark seized the opportunity. "You wanted something strange. Well, there it is." The agent's face twisted with confusion and anger, but before he could react, the ship rose into the air, its sleek alien form casting an otherworldly glow over the desert. The soldiers scrambled, unsure whether to fire or flee. Mark took a step back, shielding his eyes from the bright light. He knew this was their chance. "Get out of here," he muttered under his breath, hoping Lyra and Talia could hear him. The ship hovered for a moment, its engines roaring with power, before it shot into the sky, disappearing into the night like a comet. The soldiers stood in stunned silence, their guns lowered, as they watched the impossible unfold. The agent turned to Mark, his face pale with disbelief. What was that?" Mark shrugged, feigning ignorance. "Told you. Nothing here but old cars." The agent's jaw clenched, but there was nothing more he could do. He had lost, and Mark could see the defeat in his eyes. Without another word, the agent turned on his heel and ordered his men to retreat. As the vehicles pulled away, Mark let out a long breath. He didn't know if he would ever see Lyra or Talia again, but he knew one thing for sure. He had saved them. And somehow, that was enough. With the night sky now empty and the desert once again silent, Mark stood alone, watching the stars. Whatever adventure lay ahead for the alien girls, they were free now. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he had done something truly good. The hum of the alien ship's engines was still fresh in Mark's ears as he stood in the empty desert, watching the last military vehicle disappear over the horizon. The weight of everything that had happened settled on his shoulders, but he felt an unexpected lightness within. Against all odds, Lyra and Talia had escaped. They were free, safe, at least for now. Mark leaned against the door of his garage, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, the two alien girls were making their way back to their world, far beyond anything he could imagine. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. A part of him, small but persistent, hoped he might. For a long while, Mark stood there, replaying the events of the last few days in his mind. It felt like a blur. One moment, he was just a mechanic in a quiet desert town. And the next, he was repairing an alien spaceship and protecting two stranded beings from another world. It didn't seem real, but the faint scorch marks on the sand where the ship had lifted off reminded him that it was. The quiet of the desert began to creep back in, the world resuming its usual rhythm. Mark sighed, turning toward his garage. There was a mess to clean up, tools scattered, broken parts lying around. And though the agents were gone for now, he knew they might be back. They had seen too much. Mark would have to lay low, keep to himself, and hope that their interest in him would fade with time. But as he took a step toward the garage, a soft sound stopped him in his tracks. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then it grew clearer, a hum, familiar and unmistakable. Mark turned around, his eyes scanning the sky. At first, he saw nothing, just the stars twinkling above. But then, from the darkness, a sleek shape descended, glimmering faintly under the moonlight. The ship. It hovered just above the ground, its engines emitting a soft, calming whir. Mark's heart raced as the hatch slowly opened, and a familiar figure stepped out. Liara. She stood tall, her glowing eyes filled with a quiet determination, her posture regal and strong. Behind her, Talia followed, her expression softer, more tentative, but her eyes fixed on Mark with the same sense of gratitude and trust. Mark blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. "I thought you left," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Liara smiled, a soft, knowing smile. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. "We couldn't just leave without saying goodbye." Talia nodded, her wide eyes shimmering with emotion. "You saved us. We owe you more than we can ever repay." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to this, to being thanked, to being seen as anything more than a simple mechanic. But hearing their words, knowing the risks they had taken to come back, filled him with an overwhelming sense of warmth. "You don't owe me anything," Mark said, shaking his head. "I just did what anyone would have done." Liara's eyes softened. "No, Mark. You did what very few would have done. You helped us without asking for anything in return. You risked your life. And for that, we are forever grateful." Mark shifted uncomfortably, not used to the praise. But before he could say anything, Talia stepped forward, holding something in her hands. It was small, glowing faintly, a device of some kind, sleek and otherworldly. "This is for you," Talia said, her voice soft. "It's a beacon. If you ever need us, or if you ever want to see us again, you can use it to call us. We'll come back." Mark stared at the device, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, his fingers brushing against its cool surface. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he'd ever use it, but knowing that he could, knowing that the connection between them wasn't truly severed, filled him with a sense of comfort he hadn't expected. "Thank you," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Liara smiled again, but this time there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "We have to go now. The longer we stay, the more dangerous it becomes." Mark nodded, understanding. "I know. You need to get home." Talia stepped forward, her eyes full of a kind of sadness. "Will we ever see you again?" Mark looked between the two of them, his heart heavy. "Maybe," he said with a small smile. "But I hope so." Liara gave him a final nod, her regal posture never faltering. Talia hesitated for a moment before stepping forward and hugging Mark tightly. The gesture surprised him, but he returned the hug, feeling the warmth and gratitude in her embrace. "Goodbye, Mark," Talia whispered, stepping back. Liara nodded at him one last time before turning and leading Talia back to the ship. As the hatch closed behind them, Mark felt a strange emptiness settle over him. But it wasn't a bad feeling. It was the bittersweet sensation of saying goodbye to something important, something that had changed his life. The ship hummed to life once more, rising slowly into the night sky. Mark watched as it ascended higher and higher, until it was just a faint speck of light against the backdrop of stars. And then it was gone. Mark stood there for a long time, the beacon in his hand glowing softly. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. And as he turned back toward his garage, he couldn't help but smile. He had helped them. He had done something good. And somewhere out there, in the vastness of space, there were two alien girls who would never forget him. The next morning, the desert was calm and quiet, the way it always had been. But for Mark, everything had changed. He went about his day as usual, fixing up cars, talking to the occasional customer, but his mind was far from the garage. He found himself glancing at the sky, wondering if, out there among the stars, Lyra and Talia were thinking about him too. The beacon sat on his workbench, a constant reminder of the adventure he'd had, of the friends he'd made. He hadn't decided whether he'd ever use it, but just knowing it was there gave him a sense of peace. Life went on, but it was different now. The world seemed a little bigger, the possibilities a little wider. And as the days turned into weeks, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his story wasn't over. That one day, maybe soon, he'd hear that familiar hum of engines again and find himself standing in the desert, staring up at the stars, ready for whatever came next. Because now he knew, sometimes, the universe had a way of bringing the most unexpected people into your life. And when it did, you had to be ready. For Mark Harlow, the mechanic from a quiet desert town, the universe had brought him Lyra and Talia. And in the end, it had brought him something more: purpose, adventure, and a connection that spanned worlds. And who knows, maybe one day he'd answer that call.